Hello and welcome to Top Deck. It's that time of the month again. Today we are going to get into the monthly meta breakdown to look at the top 5 most popular decks in Standard, Pioneer, Pauper, and Modern. As always, timestamps for each format will be in the video's description. But before we start off with Standard, I need to explain the Stone Brain picks. The Stone Brain lets you name a card and exile up to 4 copies of that card you find in your opponent's hand, graveyard, and deck. So the Stone Brain picks are the 3 main deck cards that, should you name them with the Stone Brain, the deck would not function. In short, they are my choices for the best 3 cards in the deck in no particular order, and yes, I do try to switch them up from month to month for some variety. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into Standard. Please keep in mind, Standard is about to rotate, so the decks you see here have a good chance of being unfavorable in the months ahead. Starting us off as the 5th most popular deck, making up 8.2% of the meta, we have the deck most likely to die to rotation in Domain Ramp. The deck's central purpose is to get a land of every basic land type into play for some big payoff with the Domain ability. The Triomes from New Capenna were particularly helpful to this end, as each counted for 3 of the basic land types. This means you could get all 5 land types onto the battlefield as early as turn 2 with 2 Triomes. The payoffs for doing so were mainly the ability to hardcast the very powerful Atraxa and the very trusty Herd Migration. Atraxa provides you with insane card advantage as well as a 7/7 body with more keywords than Questing Beast. Herd Migration, on the other hand, creates a 3/3 beast for every basic land type in play, so you could potentially add 15 power to the board with a single card. Needless to say, Atraxa and Migration are the Stone Brain picks alongside Archangel of Wrath, which, with kicker costs, could deal 2 damage to up to 2 different targets upon ETB. This deck was a solid choice, but is unlikely to survive rotation as the Triomes will be cycling out of Standard. You could try to run this deck with Fabled Passage and the type duels from Dominaria United, but I wouldn't try it. Moving on, we have the child of the now broken home that is Esper midrange. We have Orzhov midrange, making up 11.8% of the meta. This deck wants to play good value-based creatures and beat your opponent down with card quality. This deck used to focus on getting value out of planeswalkers as opposed to creatures, but that is no longer the case since the Wandering Emperor is rotating out soon. In fact, this is the final time the Emperor will ever headline a Standard deck on this channel. Ding dong, the Wicked Witch is dead. May she rest in peace. The Stone Brain picks for this deck, however, are very much alive and kicking. I chose Sheoldred for its ability to reward your card draw while punishing your opponents. I also chose Caustic Bronco because, when you attack with it, Bronco has the Dark Confidant ability of drawing you a card in exchange for life equal to that card's mana value. However, if you saddle it, Bronco causes your opponent to lose the life instead. Virtue of Loyalty is here because it can pump your entire team and make a 2/2 body. Checking in at number 3, making up 13.6% of the meta, we have the unexpected return of Boros Convoke. The deck wants to vomit out a lot of small threats like Novice Inspector or Voldaren Epicure, which come down and make an artifact. You can blow up the artifacts with Gleeful Demolition to make some goblins, and use all of your little guys to convoke out Knight Errant of Eos, which gives you more gas before you swing out and end your opponent. It's the manifestation of Dorks Together Strong, and wins by overwhelming your opponent. For Boros Convoke, the Stone Brain picks are the aforementioned Knight Errant of Eos and Gleeful Demolition, as well as War Leader's Call, which pings your opponent whenever one of your multitude of little creatures enters the battlefield. And now, at number 2, making up 13.6% of the meta, we have Golgari Midrange. While it follows basically the same midrange plan of having better cards than your opponent that Orzhov midrange has, this deck executes that game plan with a lot more removal and more recursive threats. For example, Mosswood Dreadknight has the adventure half that lets you draw a card in exchange for 1 life. When it dies, you can replay the adventure half from your graveyard on your next turn. It makes it a source of card advantage that is rather irritating to deal with, as well as a recursive threat. It is one of the Stone Brain picks alongside Bronco for reasons discussed earlier, as well as Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal. Aclazotz is here because it is a 4/4 flying lifelinker that also has the ability of coming back from the dead if a player has one or fewer cards in the hand. Again, recursive threats that are difficult to handle is the theme of this deck. And now, moving on to the top spot making up 14.5% of the standard meta, we have the good old-fashioned mono red aggro. The game plan for this deck never changes. You play small aggressive creatures that poke your opponent before finishing them off with direct damage spells like Lightning Strike. This deck has been around forever, and it will continue to exist forever past the heat death of the universe. This deck is the most likely to survive rotation since there will always be cheap red threats to make the card list. Additionally, Bloomburrow seems to be a very aggressive set, so there should be some goodies in there to help this deck keep on truckin'. The Stonebrain picks are Swift Spear due to its ability to take over games if not answered, Slick Shot Show Off because it can end games if not answered, and Monstrous Rage, which is one of the best cards to help the other two end games if left unanswered. So now here are my quick thoughts on Standard. Bloomburrow has come, and if the early access event was any indicator of things to be, then Standard is headed to be a very, very aggressive meta. However, I think most players will enjoy that after being subjected to mid-range purgatory for so long. Standard seems like it is really fun right now, and I hope it stays that way. A healthy Standard makes a healthy Pioneer, and oh, speak of the devil, here it is, Pioneer! Starting us off with the 5th most popular deck in Pioneer at 5.5% of the meta, we have Rakdos Midrange. Keen-eyed observers will notice that this deck looks a whole lot like Rakdos Vampires, and that is because, like it or not, putting a Vein Ripper into play off Sorin is probably the best thing to be doing in these colors. This deck really only deviates from the true Vampire build by playing non-Vampire creatures like Bone Crusher Giant or Caustic Bronco. This deck is very much the you can copy my homework, but don't make it obvious of decks. For those of you who don't know how this deck works, it depends somewhat on playing value-based cards like Fable of the Mirror Breaker. At a minimum, Fable gives you 2 bodies and some card selection over 3 turns. The other big part of this deck is Sorin, Imperious Bloodlord, which you can use its -2 ability to put a vampire, namely Vein Ripper, into play. Vein Ripper is a 6/5 flyer with Ward, sacrifice a creature. It also happens to have the clause that creatures dying lets you siphon your opponent for 2 life. It is an incredibly strong and must-answer threat. It, along with Sorin and Fable, make up the Stonebrain picks for this deck. Moving on to the number 4 spot on the list, we have Nykthos Ramp. This deck is mono-green stompy and uses Nykthos Shrine to Nyx to generate mana equal to your devotion to green. This allows you to snowball into larger and more numerous green threats. The deck runs Leyline of the Guild Pact as a way to up the devotion count for free. If you didn't know, if Leyline is in your opening hand, you can begin the game with it on the battlefield, thus giving you 4 extra devotion for free. The true backbone of the deck is the 8 copies of Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystics, 1-mana dorks that tap for green. If your opponent ever begins the game with turn 1 Forest, Llanowar Elf go, always kill the elf. Make like Middle-earth orcs and kill the elf before the deck gets snowballing. The rest of the deck consists of green threats with high devotion to green, including Cavalier of Thorns. Cavalier is a 5/6 that pulls a land from the top 5 cards of your deck upon entering, and can return a card from the graveyard to your deck upon its death. Cavalier dodges a lot of common removal, and is therefore one of the Stonebrain picks alongside Nykthos and Leyline. And now, the number 3 deck in the meta, making up 12.3% of it, it's the spell-slinging, bird-slapping, undisputed king of card draw! Is it Phoenix? It's my favorite deck, and I am unabashed about this. This deck wants to put a lot of cards in the graveyard early, including hopefully some namesake Arclight Phoenixes. Arclight Phoenix has the unique ability that, if you play 3 instants and sorceries on your turn, it comes back from the graveyard to the battlefield as a hasty flying 3/2. 2 or 3 of these can act as a pretty decent clock and are easily revived if killed. The rest of the deck is mostly cantrips and burn spells to keep your hand stocked and your opponent's board clear. The big threat at the top end of the mana curve is Treasure Cruise, which allows you to delve away cards in your graveyard to draw 3 cards. Treasure Cruise helps the deck have staying power later in the game and is generally considered one of the best cards in the format. However, like Arclight Phoenix, it is easily bested by Graveyard Hate. Seriously, Leyline of the Void, rest in peace, they just kill this deck. Anyway, Cruise is a powerful card easily worthy of a Stonebrain pick alongside Phoenix. The third pick is Ledger Shredder, which is a flyer that connives whenever a player casts their second spell each turn. It can help put Phoenixes into the graveyard, as well as become a pretty sizable threat in its own right. Moving on from a deck of Immortal Phoenixes to a deck that really should hopefully die, it's Amalia combo, making up 17% of the meta. If you're new to this channel, first, welcome. Second, you should know, as much as I love Phoenix, I hate Amalia more. This deck works by putting Amalia Benavides Aguirre and Wildgrowth Walker into play at the same time before either gaining life or exploring. When life is gained, Amalia explores. When Amalia explores, Wildgrowth Walker gains some life. This creates a loop that only ends when Amalia blows up all other creatures, when she hits exactly 20 power. The only thing left standing is a very large, very lethal Spanish vampire. So why do I hate this deck? Simply put, it doesn't require much setup at all to pull off the game-winning combo, and it can go off at instant speed using Chord of Calling, which tutors a creature from your deck to the battlefield. It really feels like you have to have interaction up at every moment of the game, even if you kill all the combo pieces, since the deck runs recursion in the form of Return to the Ranks, soon to be replaced by Dewdrop Cure. Furthermore, Amalia only stops the loop when she reaches exactly 20 power, and I really want to emphasize that. Boosting your opponent's Amalia's power by a single point forces the game to be a draw. I don't like calling for cards to be banned, but I think Amalia is worthy of one. The Stonebrain picks are Amalia, Wildgrowth Walker, and Chord of Calling for obvious aforementioned reasons. And now, the most popular deck in Pioneer, accounting for a whopping 25.9% of the meta, it's Rakdos Vampires. I feel like we talked about this deck already when we discussed midrange, so the only thing I will say is that this deck tends to run more vampires like Preacher of the Schism. Rakdos midrange saw this deck, looked at Vein Ripper and said, "Hey, I want to do that too. How do you do, fellow kids?" These decks are so similar, you didn't even notice that I switched the deck lists between the two of them. This is actually a mid-range list. But not really, because I only pretended to switch them, but some of you still just believe me just now. These decks are way too similar. The Stonebrain picks are the same as the ones in Rakdos midrange for the same reasons presented there. So, rant aside, where do I think Pioneer is at the moment? Personally, I think we need Van Helsing. Adding up Vampires, Amalia, and Vampires the sequel, 48% of the decks played in Pioneer revolve around one or more vampires, and that should probably change. Statistically speaking, about 1 in 3 decks plays Vein Ripper, and that is an unhealthy amount. Where is Buffy Summers when you need her? Anyway, I hope Bloomburrow can help fix this by giving rise to some new decks. Igra already looks like a very strong option. Speaking of which, like and subscribe if you like the content so you don't miss next week's video where I actually try out an Igra combo deck. It feels really strong in playtesting, and I'm sure you won't want to miss it. Alright, enough shilling. Let's move on to the People's format. Pauper. Starting off as the 5th most popular deck in Pauper, accounting for 8.5% of the meta, we have Cruel Ramp. It wants to play Mana Acceleration early to turbo out big dumb creatures. The biggest and dumbest is Annoyed Altasaur, a 7-mana 6/5 with Reach, Trample, and Cascade. The mana ramp for this deck comes in the form of Arbor Elf untapping lands enchanted by Wildgrowth or Utopia Sprawl. These enchantments give you an extra mana every time you tap the enchanted land, so tapping one such land can put you far ahead on mana. The Stonebrain picks for this deck are Utopia Sprawl, Altasaur, and Avenging Hunter. I have Hunter as a third pick because it gives you the initiative on ETB. Initiative is a lot like venturing into the dungeon, except you have to go through the Undercity dungeon, and it triggers on your upkeep as well. There are a lot of now banned initiative cards in Pauper that basically just run through the trap room of the Undercity dungeon to make your opponent lose 5 life over and over again until they lose. For the remaining initiative cards, initiative is still a powerful mechanic, thus earning Avenging Hunter a Stonebrain pick. Moving up to number 4 with 8.8% of the meta, we have Madness Burn. This deck tries to force yourself to discard cards off effects like Faithless Looting. This lets you play Madness cards like Fiery Temper or Alms of the Vein. The Madness costs for these cards provide strong effects at above rate. For example, Alms of the Vein lets you siphon 3 life from your opponent for a single black mana if cast with Madness. The deck also plays a new card from Modern Horizons 3, Sneaky Snacker. Snacker is a 2/1 flyer that returns to the battlefield tapped when you draw your 3rd card in a turn, like Off of a Faithless Looting, for example. Its recursiveness grants it a Stonebrain pick along with Alms of the Vein. And if it wasn't obvious, Faithless Looting is the reason the deck works at all, and so it is therefore the 3rd Stonebrain pick. And now, a completely new deck that didn't exist until this past month. Allow me to introduce you to Brood Scale combo, making up 11.7% of the meta. How does this combo work? Well, here's the skinny. You play out Basking Broodscale, a little guy that makes an Eldrazi spawn whenever it gets a +1/+1 counter. It also has the ability to put a +1/+1 counter on itself for 1 and a green. The spawn token it makes is able to sacrifice itself to generate a colorless mana. You enchant Broodscale with Sadistic Glee, which puts a counter on Broodscale whenever a creature dies. I think you know where I'm headed with this. Turn 1, land, pass. Turn 2, Broodscale. Turn 3, Sadistic Glee on Broodscale, make it give itself a counter, create a spawn token, sack the spawn to make mana, Glee gives Broodscale another counter, and we make another spawn, and round we go, bada bing, bada boom, infinite ETB, death, sacrifice, mana, and counters. Add an effect giving trample, and you win the game on turn 3. In Pauper, mind you. This is definitely a deck Wizards will be watching, and the Stonebrain picks for it are Broodscale and Glee, as well as Deadly Dispute, because it can provide so much good card advantage. Moving on, we come to the number 2 deck in the meta, accounting for 12.4% of it. We have the deck your childhood bully shouts at you to hide the fact that they peaked in high school. Ooh, Burn. If you don't know how Burn works, well, hello, welcome to Magic. I hope you enjoy this game, it's a lot of fun. This deck is iconic. Cheap red threats and cheap red burn spells have gone together like PB&J since the game's creation in 1993. Burn is older than the QR code, the original Doom game, and apparently most of my YouTube audience. Like in standard mono red, the deck tries to win with lots of little creatures and finishes them off with direct damage spells like Lightning Bolt. Games do not last long against this deck. The Stonebrain picks for this deck are Lightning Bolt, Goblin Bushwhacker, and Goblin Grenade. Bolt is the standard for burn spells. Bushwhacker can pump your entire attack force by +1/+0 and give them haste if it entered the battlefield kicked. And Goblin Grenade can deal 5 damage directly to your opponent's face for the low cost of 1 red mana and sacrificing one of your many disposable lackeys. It's fair, it's fun, moving on. And now, the most popular deck in Pauper, accounting for 17.2% of it, we have Grixis Affinity. This deck wants to spew as many artifacts onto the battlefield as possible to make future spells cheaper or free altogether. Many of the cards, like Mirror Enforcer, have affinity for artifacts, so their mana cost is reduced by 1 generic mana for every artifact you control. Getting a lot of artifacts on the battlefield is easier than you might imagine. All of the lands that you see here are also artifacts, so they both cheapen and can help pay for the affinity cards. Meanwhile, other cards like Blood Fountain and Deadly Dispute make artifact tokens as part of their other effects. This deck gets permanents on the board quickly, and it doesn't mind getting rid of them since cards like Acre Wellspring draw a card when they leave the battlefield. Grixis Affinity is probably the most synergistic deck in Pauper, and it is very powerful. The Stonebrain picks for this deck are Mirror Enforcer, Sneaky Snacker, and Refurbished Familiar. Mirror Enforcer is a 4/4 that you have the chance of casting for free. Snacker is an elusive, recurable threat that we discussed earlier, and Refurbished Familiar is another elusive threat that forces your opponent to discard a card for potentially only 1 mana. So what are my thoughts for Pauper? I don't have too many. I think the format is still adjusting to the new Modern Horizons cards, but I personally like what I'm seeing. It seems to be a lot of fun. Wizards will probably have to keep an eye on Broodscale combo and probably Affinity as well, but there is a chance Broodscale combo will just become a deck that requires the allocation of a couple sideboard slots. We'll just wait and see. Now let's move on to Modern. Modern players, if you made it here, First, thank you. Second of all, I really want to know what you think at the end of this, because I want to have a more in-depth discussion about the format at the end. But let's start things off at number 5 with Goryo's Vengeance, making up 6% of the meta. This is probably the most fair deck in the meta, which is a little weird to say considering this deck is a Scaminator deck. This deck wants to put big legendary threats into the graveyard early before reanimating them with Goryo's Vengeance, an instant that gives its target haste, but forces you to exile its target at the beginning of the next end step. Decks get around the exile clause by targeting the reanimated creature with Ephemerate. Ephemerate blinks the creature, so it returns to the battlefield without needing to be exiled. This is especially useful with Atraxa, Grand Unifier, with its powerful ETB ability granting potentially insane amounts of card advantage. By the way, Ephemerate has Rebound, so you can use it twice before it goes to the graveyard. That's the central core of the deck, with the rest of the cards like Psychic Frog and Grief focusing on helping you gain and use card advantage. This deck also plays Gristlebrand, which used to be the premier reanimate target before Atraxa came along, and it can help you gain cards by paying life. The Stonebrain picks are Vengeance, Ephemerate, and Atraxa, for obvious reasons. We have a new deck as the 4th most popular in Modern, with Mardu Energy. This deck wants to utilize the long-forgotten energy mechanic to boost creatures, play extra spells, and beat in your opponent's face. The big energy producer of the deck is Guide of Souls, which is a power-crept version of Soul Warden. Guide of Souls gives you an energy and a life whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. Additionally, whenever you attack, you can spend 3 energy with Guide to give a creature 2 +1/+1 counters and flying. That's a lot for a 1-drop. Speaking of 1-drops, we also need to discuss Ocelot Pride, a first striking life linker that creates a token cat at your end step if you gained life that turn. It then creates an additional token for each token that entered the battlefield this turn if you have 10 or more permanents, which again is a lot for a 1-drop. The 2-drops aren't much better. These are headlined by Amped Raptor and Ajani, Nakatl Pariah. Amped Raptor gives you 2 energy on ETB and then allows you to exile cards from the top of your deck if you cast it from your hand. You exile cards until you hit a non-land card, and have the opportunity to play that card by spending an amount of energy equal to its mana cost. Meanwhile, Ajani comes down and makes a cat token. Whenever a cat dies, you can flip Ajani over into its Planeswalker backside that, among other things, can make more cats and almost wrath only your opponent's board. Throw in format all-stars like Orcish Bowmasters and you have a powerful deck that is, simply put, a lot. The Stonebrain picks are Ajani, Raptor, and Ocelot Pride, but you could easily convince me other cards are more deserving. Now it's time for Deja Vu. Moving on from Mardu Energy, we have Boros Energy, making up 9.4% of the meta. I have very little to say about this deck after discussing its Mardu cousin. The only thing I can really point out is that this deck replaces Thoughtseize with Lightning Bolt and replaces Orcish Bowmasters with Ragavan, the monkey that won't stop giving. If Ragavan connects with your opponent, you get a treasure and the ability to cast the top card of your opponent's deck. Oh, and you can dash it in for 2 mana for good measure. The Stonebrain picks are the same and come with the same caveats as Mardu Energy. These decks are extremely similar, so enough said, moving on. And now, at the number 2 spot, it's the same thing over and over again, Deja Vu, we have Jeskai Control, making up 9.8% of the meta. While this isn't exactly like the last 2 decks, this deck also makes good use of the energy mechanic with cards like the removal spell Galvanic Discharge and the board wipe Wrath of Skies. This deck is a classic control deck, hoping to control the flow of the game with counterspells and removal before winning with a finisher. The finisher in this deck is mainly Flage, Titan of Fire's Fury. Flage is the love child of Inferno Titan and Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. Whenever Flage enters the battlefield or attacks, it lets you Lightning Helix a target of your choosing. It's also a 6/6 body for good measure. However, it only stays on the battlefield permanently if it was played from the graveyard using the escape ability. The other big threats of this deck are the One Ring and Teferi, Time Raveler. The One Ring is simply absurd. It grants you a turn of protection from everything, and grants you more and more cards as you use it over and over again. The cards come in exchange for life, but that is a very small price to pay, all things considered. Meanwhile, Teferi, or T3 Fairy, forces your opponent to play at sorcery speed while granting your spells flash. You can also use it to bounce problematic permanents. It is a format all-star and worthy of a Stonebrain pick alongside Flage and the One Ring. Finally, last month I predicted we were headed for Combo Summer. I was right, but I bet on the wrong horse to lead us here. Or should I say, the wrong bird? You probably guessed it before the video began, but the most popular deck in Modern right now is Bant Nadu, making up 15.2% of the meta. The bird is the word, the bird needs no introduction, but I will explain it anyway. Nadu, Winged Wisdom, gives all your creatures the ability that, twice a turn, if targeted, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it onto the battlefield. If it is anything else, it goes to your hand. Having this ability trigger twice per turn per creature makes this deck snowball out of control very quickly. The primary targeting method is Shuko, the innocuous artifact that costs 1 mana and equips for nothing. You can use the lands you find off the triggers to play more creatures, which you can then target with Shuko, and so on and so forth until you basically draw your entire deck. Springheart Nantuko is another big part of this deck since it creates a 1/1 every time a land enters your side of the battlefield, thus providing more triggers. On Magic Online, decks generally win using Thassa's Oracle. However, in Pauper, it's a lot nastier. You essentially make infinite mana before infinitely looping Endurances, Bosejus, and Otawars until you completely decimate your opponent's board and pass back the turn with an infinite army of 1/1s. That's turn 3, by the way. I won't go into more detail since it is very confusing and kind of difficult to explain with a slideshow, and Nadu is very likely to get the axe at the end of the month anyway. So please don't buy into this deck, it probably won't be around in a month. Alright, so now's the part I want to hear from Modern players about, and I will preface this by asking you to pull out your tinfoil hats. The most obvious thing in the format is that Nadu is broken. So why isn't it banned already? Wizards has had ample time to ban the bird after the Modern Pro Tour, but has said they won't do anything about it until at least August. Why won't they ban Nadu? 2 words, 1 magic card. Cash grab. They simply want to make money off this card still. You don't really want to ban a Chase Rare while it is still in production because it would help discourage sales of your new product. So any thoughts that they would ban it immediately after the Pro Tour were simply put just wishful thinking. Now here's the real conspiratorial thinking. I think they broke Nadu on purpose. I think they purposefully put a card in a Modern set that they knew would be too good for the format. Why would they do this? Well, apart from the obvious neat card sells packs, I think they did it in essence to distract from the multitude of other cards that, without Nadu, would probably have the community calling to ban them. For example, they basically reprinted Necropotence and nobody blinked. Additionally, the One Ring has been compared to a 4-mana Time Walk with card advantage, and I would argue it is not good for the format. The argument for its banning gets stronger when you consider that they can't easily reprint this card, and it is already nearly $100 a piece. The price will only continue to increase and help price out people who might want to get into Modern. I think Nadu is a distraction from all of this and is designed to make the community more susceptible to the next overly power-tripped product, and I'm not really a fan of that. But tell me what you think in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Additionally, since we like shouting out other creators, check out Arcosa, who provides every argument for banning Nadu. I'll provide a link in the video description. That's all I got, so have a great day, everyone. See you around!